afternoon. I am not Pratap Mehta. My name is Partho Mukhopadhyay. I'm here at the CPR, and welcome to this book discussion on how solidarity works for welfare. I'm so glad that so many of you have turned out today, and it speaks, as I was just telling Prerna, a lot about Prerna's own fan club and popularity, both of the subject and of the person. So Prerna has just moved, not just, but fairly recently moved from Harvard, where she was teaching, to Brown, where she is now the Mahatma Gandhi Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies. And I'm glad to see that name on the chair. And she's also, of course, affiliated with the Watson Institute, and where she is the co-director of the Brown-Harvard-MIT Joint Seminar on South Asian Politics. Prerna's, in between her various research, while she was doing her research, she did spend a year, roughly, Prerna, was that?
Yeah, 18 months. Here
in around CPR. We were happy to have her around, and hopefully, at least formally in the book, she says she was happy to be here. So I'm glad that worked out okay. And the book itself is perhaps, Pratap, who knows more about these than I do, tells me is perhaps the most awarded first book in political science in the US. And given that it's entirely about India, that says a lot about Prerna. So the structure of it is roughly, we have Prerna about half an hour, 20 minutes. So, and then we have three commentators. There is Nilanjan to her right. There is Professor Santosh Mehrotra on my left. Nilanjan's with us here at JNU. Santosh is, of course, Nilanjan's here at CPR, and Santosh is at JNU. And then I'll sort of fill in with a dual role. I'll try and make it as brief as possible towards the end. So, and then, of course, we'll try and keep all of this relatively short so that you have as much time to grill Prerna as possible. So, floor's all yours.
Thank you so much for being here today, for battling the weather, the traffic, and all else that the city that we so dearly love continuously poses in our way. And so, as Partho mentioned, in the mid-2000s, I was affiliated with what was then a quiet, some might have said sleepy little institution in Chanakyapuri. And I have learned so much from my time at CPR then, now, and from so many of you who are around this table, expectedly and some unexpectedly. And it's a real special privilege to be here today. So the starting point of the book is basically a map such as this, which shows you global infant mortality rates. And the basic insight is that the place that you live has a huge impact on the kind of life that you live. So for instance, if you're an infant who's born in the state of Haiti, somewhere around there, you're 12 times more likely to celebrate your first birthday as compared to an infant who's born less than 50 miles away in the state of Cuba. Now, similarly, if you look at literacy rates, if you grow up in the state of Burkina Faso, you're 4 times more likely to be illiterate as compared to if you were in the neighboring state of Ghana. And variations of this kind exist in neighboring countries, but they also exist within the same country. So why is it that people in different parts of the world, in the same part of the world, but in adjoining countries, but within the same country, why do they lead such dramatically different lives? Why does where you're born have such an important influence on the kind of life that you live? So India provides a very rich context for an analysis of this puzzle. So if you look, for instance, and this is not new to an audience such as this, is that there are huge disparities in levels of social development. And I think of social development primarily in terms of education and health across different states in India. So again, in the 1950s, for instance, if you were born in the state of Bihar, you were twice as likely to be illiterate as compared to if you were born in the state of Himachal Pradesh. That's the literacy rates figure. In terms of infant mortality, even up until a few years ago, if you were born in the state of Maharashtra, 4 times more likely to live to celebrate your first birthday as compared to if you were born in the state of Orissa. And I've talked about literacy and infant mortality, but you could pretty much look at every indicator of education and health, and you will see such disparities. So the question really that is at the heart of the book is, why have Indian states, which are bound by the same legal, financial, and electoral systems, remained worlds apart in social development? And in the book, I argue that a shared solidarity that emerges from a sense of collective identification can be a very important motor for the institution of social policies. Now, such an argument marks a break, a quite dramatic break in some ways, from established explanations for social welfare. So this is a question that a large generation of social science, a large number of scholars across generations in social science have looked at. And a lot of the explanations that they have put forward have emphasized levels of economic development, so the almost intuitive explanation that the richer the place, the more money it has to devote to social welfare, and consequently the higher the social development outcomes will be. The nature and structure of state institutions, this is an argument that has been specially emphasized in the Western European context. So, for instance, if you're a presidential or a parliamentary system, if you have a centripetal set of institutions such as a unicameral legislature or proportional representations versus first past the post. So all these differences in the structure of institutions have been shown to have important influences on social welfare. And yet that's the beauty or the elegance of comparing states within India, is that you can, in a sense, hold the nature and structure of state institutions, a democracy, a first past the post electoral system, you can hold these constant in a research design such as this. An important and influential body of scholarship has emphasized the importance of class-based politics, and particularly the role of communist parties. People like Atul Kohli, my former PhD advisor, but also Patrick Heller, as well as a number of other people, would emphasize, would trace back differences in social welfare to the differences in the nature of class organization and political parties. Similarly, people like Pradeep Chhibber, Irfan Nuruddin, as well as a number of other scholars have said that actually differences in social development are a factor or a product of the nature of political competition. The basic argument goes back to V.O. Keyes in American politics, which is that if you have a more competitive system, political parties are more likely to reach out and basically provide goods across the spectrum of different class-based. His point was you get both the haves and the have-nots. So the basic argument is more intense political competition and the better public goods provision. Similarly, you have arguments about ethnic diversity and the fact that ethnic diversity is supposed to be bad for the provision of public goods. And arguments made by Robert Putnam in the American context and someone like Ashutosh Varshney, as well as Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph, in whose memory actually Pratap is giving a lecture as I speak here today at the University of Chicago Center, would all argue for the importance of civil society and social capital. So an argument such as mine that instead emphasizes the role of a shared solidarity is in quite a drastic contrast to the established body of literature that has tried to understand social welfare. It's also in contrast to the scholarship on identity and welfare, which has usually taken a very negative view of the role of identity and welfare. So John Donne, who was actually one of my former teachers at Cambridge, had famously written that nationalism is the starkest political shame of the 20th century. And similarly, when you think of most of the scholarship on nationalism, the idea is that it's associated with xenophobia, with exclusion, and certainly all identities do need to have an other. There is an element of exclusion that is inherent in a sense of also coming together as us. In order to be us, we need a them. And yet, in a sense, to emphasize the constructive potential of a shared solidarity, especially when it falls short of a claim to sovereignty, is, I think, an important argument that has not yet been made in the scholarship on identity. So the solidarity argument, basically as it holds for Indian states, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more in detail, would argue, want to crush you through my talk, is that it will lead both to state action as well as societal action, the institution of a progressive social policy, as well as more popular involvement with social services that will together give rise to differences in social development. So in order to make the theoretical foundations of this argument, I rely on two bodies of quite distinct scholarship. The first is arguments in social identity theory and social psychology, and the second is, in a way, harkening back to my own training as a political theorist, to liberal nationalist scholarship in political theory. So laboratory as well as field experiments in social identity theory have consistently and robustly demonstrated that when people are encouraged to think of themselves as an us, as part of a single superordinate identity, it fundamentally changes the way that you think about your fellow group members. So a simple experiment, to kind of just give you an idea of the nature of the experiments, there doesn't need to be a very core basis for this identification. If we simply divide this room into, for instance, people who are wearing glasses and not wearing glasses, it's always a good example in an academic setting. Just the simple fact that we have divided you into these two groups becomes an important basis for distinction. So in social identity theory, they've shown that the importance of a group translates into the way we think of collective as well as self-interest. So it's not that you cease to think of self-interest. It's not that if I wear glasses, which I do usually, it's not that I do not have a sense of another identity, but it does mean that other people who wear glasses and that have critically now been shown to me to be fellow members of my community, I think of them as a us. And so I will prioritize their welfare, and their welfare becomes part of my own welfare. In a sense, that when you do not have such a sense of community, you're not likely to think of an S, of an us. So the general idea is it transforms you from a me to a broader we identity. And most of these experiments go back to a Frenchman called Henri Tajfel, but he was the first in a long lineage of people who've done a similar set of studies. So that's how you might think of the argument in terms of the psychological effects of group identification. Another equally important basis is in terms of the moral obligations of community. There's an Israeli political theorist called Yuli Tamir, and she has a book in which she says it's the magic of the pronoun my. So her point is, when you think of a community as being yours, when you have a sense of an affective attachment, when there's a cohesiveness of community, it makes you more likely to favor social justice across this community. The general idea again being that you have a certain sense of an ethical or a moral obligation to members of your fellow community. So fusing together these theoretical insights from what are otherwise important but distinct bodies of scholarship, I make the argument that political elites in states of India that have had a stronger sense of a shared solidarity have historically been more likely to put in place policies for collective welfare, and in particular in terms of education and health. And I demonstrate this argument in the book through what in American political science is generally called a mixed methods research design, but the general idea is that the book looks both at a comparative historical analysis of 5 states in India, and I do this based on a variety of different sources. And once the argument is developed across these 5 states, I then test it in a statistical analysis of all Indian states. And I won't really be presenting the statistics in much detail today, but I'm very happy to talk about them. And so, please feel free to ask me questions, and I'm sure, Nilanjan will talk about that a little bit, I'm sure, as well. So how did I choose the 5 states that I study? This is a very simple diagram in a sense, is that it shows you a very intuitive relationship which does hold between the level of economic development in an Indian state and its level of social development. So the fact that you see an upward sloping line on top and a downward sloping line here basically just says that the richer the state in India in general, the higher its literacy, and the poorer the state in India, the worse its infant mortality. And yet, if you look at this, you will see that there are a number of outliers. So even though this is a general relationship that holds across many states in India, it is the case that you can be relatively poor but punch above your weight and have better social welfare, as the states that are above the line there and below the line here would indicate, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Or you can be poor and yet actually do much worse than would be expected by your level of economic development. And those would be states such as Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh, as well as the state of Bihar, which is really a shadow case study that I added more towards the end, it wasn't in the PhD dissertation to kind of put it in a teleological manner, but did make its way in the book, partly because of developments that were happening in Bihar under Nitish Kumar in the 2000s, that again, I'm happy to talk about. But the basic idea is that I studied two neighboring northern central states, Rajasthan and UP in a fair amount of detail, as well as the state of Bihar, and two adjoining southern states, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And I traced these states historically from the mid-19th century onwards, and the comparative historical analysis of these 5 states forms most of the bulk of the book, which I'll show you from the table of contents. So what's interesting is that these 5 states are fairly evenly matched on a number of socioeconomic indicators. Even if you go back to this graph here, you'll see that actually, in a sense, Kerala and Uttar Pradesh have had very similar levels of economic development measured in terms of per capita state domestic product from the 1960s onwards. If anything, Kerala has actually usually up until around the 1990s, and there think of the role of remittances really kicking in, has actually been in a worse economic position than the state of UP. And so again, this in a sense kind of amps up the interest, which is that, Kerala is poorer than UP, and yet it does so much better, kind of the poster child of social development across the world. So not only are they fairly evenly matched, it's also the fact that they in a sense exemplify the nature of disparity that you see among Indian states. So in the 1990s, if you happen to be a woman who was living in a village in UP, you were on average expected to live 15 years less than if you were a rural woman in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And you were 3 times more likely basically not to be able to read or write your own name, which is the census definition of literacy in India. But of course, these differences, which we now kind of think, especially among a community such as this, we take these, this is kind of conventional wisdom for us. Kerala is a poster child for social development, UP is a basket case. And yet, if you just go back not even 150 years ago, Kerala and UP were in very similar positions in terms of social development. So if you go back to the late 19th century, the first census in colonial India, Kerala and UP had very similar levels of literacy, very similar levels of infant mortality. In fact, the scholarship on Kerala was bemoaning the fact that the state of Travancore, which is the bulk of what is now present-day Kerala, had no attention at all paid to social welfare. There were hardly any schools. The rate of infectious diseases was very high. And UP, in contrast, is the kind of model province of India. East India Company officials are jockeying with each other in London to get a posting to UP. UP is supposed to be the best governed of all provinces. It's really the kind of gem in the crown of British colonialism. And yet, that's 150 years ago. And so in a sense, that's where I begin the story. I go back to a time when there wasn't much to distinguish in terms of the social welfare of Kerala and UP, and trace this to say, how is it that from the 1880s, 2 states that were remarkably similar in being quite backward, how do you see these differences in their trajectories evolve over the next 150 years to the point that you get to the comparison of the village, of the rural woman that I spoke about at the beginning? So in the book, most of the bulk of the empirical chapters are chapters 3, 4, and 5, and I begin by tracing the origins of the differential strength of subnationalism in these 4 states. I talk about how it is that the sense of shared solidarity emerges in the states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, but not so in the states of Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh. And then I show how this sense of a Malayali subnationalism, a Tamil subnationalism, how is it that these differences then give rise to differences in levels of education and health. And obviously, I don't have the time to kind of walk you through this argument in any detail. So what I thought I'd do is just give you a flavor of it by talking just a little bit about the 2 states that, again, exemplify not just these differences in levels of social development, but also in terms of the strength of subnationalism. This is taken from chapter 6 in the book, which is the statistical chapter, and is just a graphic description of a measure that I create to measure the strength of subnationalism. So I'm happy again to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it now, but happy to take questions on it. I come up with a measure for how you might think of measuring the strength of solidarity in a state in India. And I then put this measure into statistical regressions to show that it's positively associated with a variety of social outcomes. But this is what that measure looks like, just in terms of, eyeballing different levels of solidarity in states across India. And I'm happy to talk about what goes into the index. I'll give you a sense of how it's constructed for Kerala and UP that will give you some insight for what it looks like. But Kerala is one of the most solidaristic states in India, and UP is, I would say, the state in India with the most fractured regional solidarity. And how exactly do these give rise to differences in their levels of social welfare? So just to give you a sense of it, some of the things that go into the index, not always. So the kind of background I should say for a second is, when I began to study subnationalism, Lloyd and Sue Rudolph, who passed away this year, told me there's no such thing. They would call it regionalism. A lot of people were uncertain about the term. They said, well, what do you mean by a regional solidarity? What do you mean by regionalism? And in a sense, it's a concept that goes back, in that there are lots of people who've written about it, but it wasn't a concept that had really been brought in a systematic way onto the scholarly table. And so in order to study subnationalism, I went back to some of the classic writing on nationalism. People like Benedict Anderson, Clifford Geertz, Ernest of Hobsbawm, Eric Hobsbawm, Gellner, and a variety of scholars who've written about nationalism. And I tried to say, okay, what can we get out of their writings that would inform an understanding of subnationalism in the Indian context? So some of the things, so everything that you see here in the left-hand side column is in a way going back to classic understandings of nationalism, many of which have said you need to have a myth of common origin. So when I was doing fieldwork in Kerala and UP, I went around trying to understand, mostly through interviews with historians, is there a myth of how this state came into being? And this question struck people in UP as just patently odd. The question itself did not really make sense to them. In Kerala, I needed to ask this question even through a translator. I needed to just about articulate it, and people would be like, of course, Parshuram. And then I realized not only is there a myth, this myth is a common myth across Kerala, which is that, Lord Parshuram flings his axe into the sea, a piece of land is separated, and the land of Kerala is born. So there's a myth of common origin in the sense that there certainly isn't one for the state of UP. A number of scholars of nationalism would argue for the centrality of language. Kerala has a common and distinctive language, Malayalam. In UP, I don't want to say that there isn't a common language. In a sense, and the chapter on UP talks about this in great detail, going back to the work, for instance, of someone like Paul Brass. But the basic argument would be that Hindi is hardly a common language insofar as it deliberately, through census classification, glosses over a number of dialects, which in many ways are independent languages. But also, of course, that in the whole Hindi-Urdu conflict and the move by people like Gandhi and Nehru into kind of saying Hindustani is the language of UP and by extension the language of all North Central Indian, what we now think of as Hindi speakers. So it's a political, language is I'm not talking about language as a demographic construct, I'm thinking of it as a political construction. And in UP, there is no way that there has been a construction of a shared language. Even if you were, for instance, which I wouldn't say to say that Hindi is a common language, the additional problem that it poses is that it's not a distinctive language. So in a lot of the scholarship on nationalism, it's not just that all of us in this room need to be able to speak the same language, it's the fact that everyone at JNU must speak a different language, right? That's what helps us distinguish ourselves, a common and a distinctive language. And there is, so even if you were to say that Hindi is a common language, it's by no means a distinctive language for the state of UP. In terms of a common culture, there has been, again, this is a political construction, but the state of Kerala has been characterized by active attempts in creating a national festival. And the critical thing to mention here is that Kerala is the most religiously diverse state in India. Second largest proportion of Muslims, only to Kashmir, highest proportion of Christians. And there's a deliberate construction of something like Onam as a festival that is shared across religious boundaries. National art forms, in the 60s and 70s, the state government had said we will entertain no more proposals from Kerala state, because they were constantly petitioning for Kathakali, Kalarapattam, a variety of state forms of art were all to become national forms according to the Kerala government. But to me this is interesting because it indicates a very high level of solidarity. Nothing similar in UP. In fact, it's interesting when you think of a common culture. This book is taken from Gyanesh Kudaisia's excellent book called UP is the Heartland of India, in which he basically makes the argument that UP is the heartland of India, but there's really nothing that holds UP together at all. This is a map from the 1931 colonial census in which they talk about the fact, so this is the map is called the cultural regions of UP. So it also to some extent kind of speaks to the point about different languages or dialects dividing UP into these distinct spheres. So Kerala, the state of Kerala is the result of an active political movement called the Aikya Kerala movement, the One Kerala movement that began in the late 19th century. Huge public gatherings, a very emotional set of poetry and anthems that accompanied it, such that when the States Reorganization Commission had basically again to say, we will not hear any more petitions from the people of Kerala, your state is being created. When I was looking at the National Archives, one particular document came and it was in butter paper and, cling film. And so I asked the archivists, why is this in cling film? And they said, we don't know, it's how it's always been there. I was one of the first, no one had ever consulted this particular record before for whatever reason. And when I opened it, I realized it was because it contained 101 signatures in blood. And so all of these signatures had been signed in blood, and they were from the states of Travancore, Cochin, and Malabar, asking for the creation of the state of Kerala. So all of these were petitions being submitted to the States Reorganization Commission, and the file for Kerala is that thick and has, particularly important examples of the degree of emotion that was attached to these petitions. UP, on the other hand, is the only state that had a dissenting note from the States Reorganization Commission. Panikkar in the report actually said, I disagree with the two other members. The state of UP should not be created. It should instead be two states. I think of this as epitomized by the saga of the naming of UP. The first name so a special committee was formed to say, what should this large chunk of North Central India be called? The first name they came up with was Hindustan. And Nehru was like, what is this? He sent it back. The second name they come up unanimously with is Aryavrat. Of course, this is, post-Second World War. It's sent back immediately, after which they come up with Ram Rajya. The third one is a particularly nice one. It's called Krishan Kushal Pradesh. At which point in time, Nehru lost his temper. The committee was told, guys, you have guys, they were all guys. You have you have 4 days to make up your mind. And basically they said, look, we used to be the United Provinces, UP, and so there's a kind of established nomenclature, so we'll now just become Uttar Pradesh, which of course served as the model for Madhya Pradesh. And so there's a way in which, in a sense you can think of these as anecdotes, but I think they're anecdotes that kind of speak to the very core differences in the way that these states came into existence in the first place and the politics behind that. I can also talk about the state seal of UP. I'll just flag it for those of you, if you ever kind of just Google the state seal of UP, you'll be confronted by quite an interesting piece of art, if you may call it that, and there's a whole history about why the state seal of UP looks the way that it does. But to get back to it, the indicator, the measure of subnationalism also includes whether or not there was a subnationalist political party. And I would argue that the Communist Party of Kerala is as much of a subnational party as it is a communist party. And the reason why I would say that is both through looking at the writings of someone like E.M.S. Nambudripad, who's pictured in the Mund at the head of that procession, who was of course the leader of the Communist Party and Kerala's first communist chief minister. If you look at his corpus of writings, he's written a book called Kerala Yesterday, Today and Tomorrow, Matribhumi, The National Question, Proud to be Malayali, as well as a 4-volume long social history of Kerala. And so he is, as much by his own writings as well as by the recollections of a number of his associates who I had an opportunity to interview, was a staunchly Malayali. They say he was Malayali first and communist second. That's the kind of quote by one of his closest associates. But if you look at the 1951 election manifesto of the Communist Party, first elections that they're contesting, the title of the manifesto on the front page is "Choose a government that will take care of the Malayali people." So to me that again is a kind of clear instance, and to me a support for the fact that I think that the Communist Party of Kerala can be thought of as a subnationalist party. The last one that I talk about is whether or not there's been a separatist movement within the state. Many separatist movements within UP, of which the only successful one has been Uttarakhand. And in a sense, these go back to the time of the construction of UP, which was quite fraught in the first instance. 97 legislators from West UP had actually said, we do not want to be a part of UP. They petitioned for the creation of a separate state of Agra. So they had said, look, there should be Agra and Awadh, which is what we always were. And Kerala has not seen anything at all of the same scale. It's just some potted pictures of the Uttarakhand agitation. But eventually, what I argue in the book is that these very different levels and both the nature as well as the content of this subnational identification has important influences for the way in which social policy gets institutionalized. And in the case of UP, I look at it across 3 different time periods, but what I just want to flag is the 1950s or the 1980s. So UP, and I'm, of course, one of the reasons why I'm talking more about UP is because we are in the present political context, but it's also the fact that UP is interesting because its identity basically goes from something below subnationalism, religion and caste, to the national. So it kind of almost skips the subnational sphere entirely. And in many ways, UP has been very proud of that. The idea that, India that is UP that is India, and they've been very, very proud of this national association. And what I want to argue is that in the 1950s to the 80s, actually Indian nationalism, it really exacts an enormous toll on UP's development. And I'll just give you a sense of that by giving you this. This is from Shankar, who I think was an astute and incisive commentator of Indian politics. And he said, look, a geographical exhibition has opened in UP. We now know where UP is. And he was mocking a very important phenomena that had begun to happen at the time that this was published, which is all the nationalist leaders who had been schooled in UP, who had taken over UP, were all basically leaving en masse to join the central government. UP politics was merely a rehearsal stage for central stage politics. And what it meant was, of course, that there were no true UP politicians, or at least if you were a UP politician, it was because you could not succeed at the national stage. But what it meant was basically that the national government dictated, either implicitly or because of your own self-expectation and views, it dictated UP politics. And so there's no independent state agenda. If you look at the questions on which UP elections are fought in the 60s and 70s, it's the idea of promotion of Hindi as the national language. UP is devoting precious state resources into commissioning dictionaries, lexicons of this new official language, to export it to states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu to school them in the new national Hindi. They're fought on questions of national danger. So, for instance, mentions of Pakistan figure very prominently in UP election manifestos. And if you look at the state budget, if you really say, look, all of this is talk, where does the money go? And the UP budget just mirrors the national government budget in a way that UP is spending 43.5% of its total investment in mid-1980s on economic services and just over 3% on social services, even though at this point in time, UP houses 95% of the world's total illiterates. And so, to me, the argument, is built across Indian states, but in the conclusion to the book, in chapter 7, I talk about how the idea that a national solidarity can be an important impetus for the institution of national welfare is one that has been made by scholarship on the institution of the welfare state in Britain as well as in Europe more broadly. I talk about the absence of the welfare state in the US and the role that the absence of a national solidarity might have played. And I also talk and this is mostly through reference to other people's work. The idea is less that I know little about these places and just I draw on other people's scholarship to talk about how the argument might travel beyond India. And then I look in some detail at what I would think of are 2 other instances of subnationalism, the provinces of Quebec and Scotland, to show how, relative to other parts of Canada and the UK, they have had very progressive levels of social welfare. So in conclusion, I just want to point to the theoretical implications of this work, and one of the ways, I never know whether it's a compliment or not, but the argument is often described as provocative. And I take that to mean that it's something new, but in a sense, I often say to these people, it's also an argument that's very old, because it joins arguments about the importance of solidarity for economic development. So people like Saint-Simon or Frederick List all made arguments for how solidarity was a necessary condition for economic growth, as well as it joins arguments about the importance of solidarity for democracy. So John Stuart Mill had famously said that without a common sense of fellow feeling, without a common sense of attachment, there can be no robust democratic politics. But of course, what's so interesting, and I have to thank Pratap for this because he's first sent me the note, is so Obama yesterday in his farewell address said, look, understand, democracy does not require uniformity. And this is critical because I'm not making an argument that you need ethnic homogeneity. And I think it's really important to make that distinction. I'm not saying that all of us are the same or need to be the same. Linda Colley famously said in her book on Britain's identity is not like a hat. You don't just wear one at one time. You can be a number of other things. The critical thing is, do you also wear a hat of solidarity, in a sense, to extend her metaphor? And Obama says, look, democracy does not require uniformity, but it does require a basic sense of solidarity. The idea that for all our outward differences, we are all in this together and that we rise and fall as one. And the American media has kind of picked up on this quote in particular in the present political climate. But the argument that I make for social welfare in the context of Indian states, in a way, can be seen as a kind of extension or building upon or advancing a very similar set of arguments. And just quickly, in terms of policy implications, there are so many of you across the table who've thought about this far more systematically than I have. But one of the ways to think about it is, I think that when we are creating administrative units, that's anything but an administrative decision. Insofar as you really need to think what the boundaries on locus of identification is, because I think this has important implications for the success of your administrative unit. I think this is important debates about federalism and decentralization. And also I think about the interlinkages between culture and social welfare policy. We often think of these as very distinct departments and ministries, but here's an argument for how the kinds of festivals you celebrate, what you name your roads, and the heroes or heroines that you put up, what differences that makes for social welfare and human development. Thank you.
Thank you, Prerna. Prerna's left a lot of room for questions because she only touched on highlights of the book. So there is, for a lot of you who may have gone through it already, I'm sure there is a lot that you can begin to ask her. But before we get to that, we can begin by asking Professor Santosh Mehrotra. Currently at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and also somebody who's been very deeply interested in issues relating to the progress of social welfare across Indian states, and in fact was possibly among the people who figured out exactly how much money would go to some of these states for spending on these accounts. So very much an insider from the government point of view, and we could look forward to seeing you and see how far you agree with Prerna's proposition. Because in some senses, if you take Prerna's proposition, whatever had to be done was done in 56, and then not much was left to be done thereafter.
Thank you very much indeed, Partho, and to Pratap for inviting me. And I must say that I was delighted to be asked to speak about this book, because I was really delighted to read the book. I learned a lot from it, and it was very riveting, I must say. And hats off to you, Prerna, for being such a great scholar. I already knew you as a very good scholar, but you've demonstrated beyond any shadow of doubt how good a scholar you are, and it's truly a book worth reading. Now, I don't think you've called me here to hear mere praises of the book, And I have worked on these issues for a while. Like Prerna has been I've been concerned about this north-south divide, what drove it, especially, as she rightly said, these states began at roughly the same level of per capita income and roughly similar levels of social indicators. I must say that the book is deceptively elegant in the conclusion that she arrives at. I say that because this is one of the most diverse countries in the world. There is no country in the world as diverse as ours. And it's difficult to arrive at such a deceptively easy conclusion as mainly subnationalism determining these outcomes. And I will speak about North versus South when we're really talking about, when you're talking about South, you're talking about the Western states versus the Northern and the Eastern states in India. But, for simplicity, I'll just speak about North and South. I would argue that actually the differences between North and South in terms of social indicators, and I will focus exclusively on that social policy dimension, owes its differences, these differences are accounted for by much more structural and powerful structural and social forces rather than subnationalism per se. And I would regard four of these forces as being: one, demography, meaning thereby the caste composition of the state and its implications for political movements. The second is social movements. By social movements I mean caste-based mobilizations in the different states and their nature. It's another way, caste-based mobilization is also one way of looking at solidarity, but it's a very, very different way of looking at solidarity. The third is how the political structure evolved. How many political parties emerged as a result of these social movements? And fourth and finally, what was the nature of the agrarian system? Was it Rayatwari or was it Zamindari? And each of these, I believe, or each of these four contributes separately, but together in a mutually reinforcing way, to account for the differences between North and South, and not so much subnationalism. I must say that I hate to be so critical of the book, despite the fact I admire it enormously and admire her enormously. I will now from this point sort of look at each of the states that she discusses. Tamil Nadu. It's interesting that Prerna doesn't at all mention what the nature of the caste composition in any of the states is. I was willing to give her the subnationalist argument. I felt that the subnationalist argument was perhaps succeeding in the Tamil Nadu case because it was one clear-cut case across the country of regionalism turning into subnationalism. But even there, I'm sorry to say, I couldn't convince myself, much as I would have liked to convince myself of her argument. If you look at the demography, well, Tamil Nadu is quite unusual. 71% of its, and we've studied this rather carefully in the India Human Development Report 2011, because we were asked by the Planning Commission to examine very, very carefully how have social indicators moved for social groups, i.e. caste groups, SCs, STs, OBCs, others, and then for religious groups, Muslims, Hindus. So, quite apart from my earlier work on, caste and well-being in Uttar Pradesh, where UP is not like Tamil Nadu, this is an issue that we looked at very carefully, empirically. And the demography jumps out at you, the demographic composition. 71% of the population is OBC, 23% are SCs, and there's a very small proportion of upper castes. Now, while Prerna does talk about social movements in Tamil Nadu, they appear only as grist to the mill of the subnationalist argument, which I find somewhat unconvincing, because we know that from the 1920s onwards, Periyar, who was a forward caste leader, mobilizes these OBCs and SCs against Brahmin domination, and Brahmin domination was very significant. And this movement cuts across the OBC and the SC communities. So there is a notion of solidarity there, but it's a very different notion. And this social movement then mutates into a subnationalist one, but it still remains dominantly, primarily an anti-Brahmanical and pro-OBC SC movement. I mean, the subnationalist dimension that it mutates into the DMK meaning, Periyar's movement, is only a step in the sequence of that we see here. When the DMK then forms, it's making a very strong case for social policies, social actions, which bring up the OBCs and the SCs. And when the DMK splits into AI-DMK and DMK, well, you then have the new dynamic of competitive electoral politics. So a similar dynamic that you see in Kerala, in other words, between the left front on the one hand and the Congress-led UDF on the other. This competitive electoral politics early on, having been given, of course, a fillip by Periyar's anti-Brahmanical movement, and after later sort of mutating into this quote-unquote subnationalist movement, the competitiveness of the politics actually pushes social policies and social outcomes in a way that is comparable to what you see in Kerala. My final point is about agrarian systems in Tamil Nadu. Unlike in UP, Bihar, the permanent settlement areas, which are all zamindari areas, and Prerna doesn't even mention what the agrarian system looks like in the north versus the south at all. Unlike in UP and Bihar, which were very much zamindari and talukadari based systems, agrarian systems, in the Bombay presidency as well as the Madras presidency, and all these southern states actually pretty much southern western states are pretty much covered by a Rayatwari system predominantly. You see, in the Rayatwari system, between the state and the peasant, there is no intermediary. The state levies the land tax, and that's it. There is no intermediary there. In the zamindari system, there is a whole system of infeudation. In other words, there's a whole sort of slew of intermediate zamindars between the state, between the British Raj and the peasantry. So what I'm saying is that in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, in Karnataka, you don't have this pushback as you do have in the zamindari areas, in Bengal, etc. Pushback by the zamindars, either on land reform. I'm sorry, on social policy. In these areas, in Rayatwari areas, you get some land reform in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, because there's no intermediate group which is pushing back, and there's no intermediate group which is pushing back on social policy either in the Tamil Nadu Kerala cases. Let me turn very quickly to Kerala. There, the demography is also rather similar. You OBC 62%, scheduled caste 10%, that's 72%, three-fourths of the population is SC OBC. Now, then, let me turn to the social movements. Of course, the social movement in Travancore, Narayan Guru in Travancore is an Isava who's, in today's terms, an OBC, but an Isava who are, even below the untouchable. These are unseeable. And yet he is the leader he leads this movement, which sort of is essentially making the case for better social policies and upliftment of the lower caste. Of course, there's an additional complication in the Kerala case because Christian missionary schools begin to establish themselves, by which the Raja of Travancore feels threatened. But then if you sort of fast forward to post-independence period, you get a two-party political system emerging, which you don't have in UP, which you've rarely, if ever, had in Bihar either. And again, Kerala sees land reform partly because it is already a Rayatwari area where there is a possibility of doing this without pushback. Let me now quickly move to UP. Looking at the demographic composition, the caste composition of UP, 19% SCs, it's not very clear what the proportion of OBCs is, but sort of I'm using NSS data for, 70% are OBC. You would think that this is a state or an area which is ripe for a social movement, but which doesn't materialize. Why? Now, to some extent, Prerna is right when she talks about, the Rajput, Brahmin, Muslim elite. But when she speaks about the elite, she doesn't for a minute mention the Zamindari, Talukadari system, which is so critical to understanding the UP scenario, pre-independence as well as post-independence. And if these were the people who would push back both on make sure that the land reform is weakened when the Zamindari abolition takes place in 1956. And of course, no notion of social policies. When you do get a social movement, you have Mayawati, the BSP for the Dalits, and then you have Mulayam, the Samajwadi Party for the OBCs. But not really for all the OBCs even there, just the Yadavs. And notice that you have the social mobilization, but no intellectual stalwart anywhere comparable to Narayan Guru or Periyar. You have political leaders like Mayawati, a school teacher essentially, who learned how to mobilize the Jatavs among the Dalits. In 2012 she won the non-Jatav vote, but in 2014 even the non-Jatavs deserted her, and the Jatavs of course deserted her. So the Zamindari abolition in any case turns out to be a sham, and if the Zamindars are then later essentially mutating into Yadavs who dominate and exploit the scheduled castes. That's why you have this contradiction in a Marxian sense between the Yadavs, OBCs, and the Dalit SCs. That's why the SP and the BSP would never get together. So you have SP, BSP splitting away from the Congress, but the trouble with the two so-called social movements, if one can call them that, I'm talking about SP, BSP, is that they're not really about social policy or upliftment of bringing out tangible gains. It's about Hathi ke Imaratein and parks and stuff like that. I'm obviously exaggerating. I've written about this in some detail. But they're essentially concerned about political power and not cross-caste solidarity. In Tamil Nadu, Kerala, you see cross-caste solidarity and not and their movements don't ask for cross-caste solidarity. Cross-caste solidarity, if anything, they're at each other's throats all the time, even today. So what do you get in terms of the political outcome? Well, political structure, you have four parties today, BJP, Congress on the one hand, SP and BSP on the other, and not two. So no competitive electoral politics is possible. How would you get a social policy consensus in this kind of situation? So I don't want to go on too long. I could make a similar argument about Bihar, but in all of these, I particularly enjoyed reading her chapter on Rajasthan, so which set me thinking. Then, I was wondering what, it has always bothered me how of the four Bimaru, sort of the two are racing ahead, and which is Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. And Bihar is sort of coming along rather nicely. And I could explain Bihar also in terms of my fourfold determinants, but in the interest of time, I will not go into it. But I do need to look at, briefly Rajasthan, which is her case study, and Madhya Pradesh, which is not. Because Madhya Pradesh sort of still bothered me as to what went right in Madhya Pradesh. Because their social indicators are sort of increasingly comparable to those of the other states and comparable to those of Rajasthan, and certainly far ahead and far better than UP or Bihar. Rajasthan, why was it a Bimaru state? That to me it's fairly self-evident. It was dominated, as Prerna rightly points out, by the princely states, and the agrarian structure is absolutely critical to the outcome there. So, if you don't get social policies which are progressive, why would you even expect them? But that had a lot to do with the fact that you had princelings ruling until independence, and even well after independence, practically, they were the leaders of the Swatantra and the Congress Party of Rajasthan. And you don't see any social movement worth the name of the lower caste. However, come post-emergency, you do begin to see the emergence of a two-party system, which is what has happened in Rajasthan since, in 1977, for the first time, the Congress is dislodged, and for at least 2 to 3 years they are in power. And since then, while one party has been in power, often the other comes to power, and this back and forth, the ding-dong itself, has been a factor which has resulted in Rajasthan's social policies being somewhat more progressive than would otherwise have been the case. Madhya Pradesh, why Bimaru? Well, again, in that sense, Madhya Pradesh is similar to Rajasthan, though perhaps somewhat less so, in the sense that the princely states were dominating at independence, and the Zamindari pushback was perhaps equally important here, just as the princely pushback would have been important in the first 2 or 3 decades after independence. But interestingly, again, like Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh has seen the emergence in the last 30-odd years of a two-party system. A competitive, because Digvijay Singh's 93 to 2003 government, because Chauhan has been in power, if I remember correctly, from 2004 onwards, was very progressive. It made very interesting interventions in the social sector, and BJP was reasonably competitive and doing quite well, even in Madhya Pradesh, and so you've seen the emergence of a two-party system here. Anyway, let me close by saying that to me these 4 sets of factors are far more important than subnationalism per se, and as I said, in the case of Tamil Nadu, subnationalism is but a step in the sequence of these 4 forces in play, which lead to result in social policies being much stronger in the southern states. Let me close by just saying that the good news for all of us is that across the north and the south, convergence is taking place in terms of HDI, in terms of health indicators, in terms of education indicators. That's what we demonstrated in no uncertain terms in the second only National Human Development Report of 2011, which I mentioned earlier. And it's interesting that there's convergence taking place between SCs and the rest, STs and the rest, Muslims and the rest. And it's interesting that if you look, and I go back to this point about demography, which I began with, that it's the poorest states, the northern states, which have in fact a concentration of the most the poorest and the most socially backward in terms of social indicators, communities of India, meaning SCs, STs, and Muslims, are actually quite concentrated in the poorer northern and eastern states. So if I'm saying that there is actual convergence taking place between the states in terms of health and education indicators and HDI, it also means that it's being driven by these two factors, meaning the SCs, STs, Muslims, they are all doing better, and of course they are concentrated in these northern and poorer states. So it's not surprising that you're getting to see convergence in HDI. Thank you very much.
So, I was going to say something, but let's hold on for the moment and then move to Nilanjan for the next set of comments. I mean, here I see two large themes in Santhosh's comments which would be interesting to hear Prerna respond to. One is the story of the agrarian structure, and the other is the one of political competition. Political competition story is, of course, something that's been written a lot about. But then, Nilanjan.
First, let me say that I'm really honored to comment on this book. It's a really compelling read. As you heard in the introduction, it's also a much awarded book. It's an extremely well written book. So if you haven't read it, I absolutely recommend it. It's an extremely carefully researched book. And that's one of the things that comes through. I think when somebody sort of, unfortunately, one of the problems we have when we have to title a book, right? I think when I first saw the title of this book, I was like, well, that's obvious, right? But it's not obvious, and there are a lot of things that are in this book that are sort of required reading and required understanding to understand the sort of the nuances of this argument. So I really enjoyed reading the book, and the way that I'm going to sort of treat my time, it's a book that's already been published. It's a book that a lot of people believe is really a seminal book and an important book for understanding social development in India. So I want to use this time to sort of ask a set of questions and see if Prerna can tell us a little bit about how the research that she's put in might help us understand some of the other cases that exist in India, and some of the other things that we're starting to see in India, as well as how perhaps some of the movements that she has discussed may have ended up differently, in sort of a parallel world. So first, before I sort of get into sort of the main comments, let me start by sort of situating this in existing political science literature. Some of it, Prerna talked about, but I want to sort of, I'm not sure that people in the room have a full understanding of what it is that Prerna is actually pushing back against. And there is a very sort of strong literature in political science that says, if you have social fractionalization, you're screwed. That's it. There'll likely be a civil war. Certainly you can forget about social development. There are two sort of lines. One is you sort of have God-given social fractionalization. That's it. Another one is a slightly more nuanced argument which says, okay, well, you might get sort of differing states with different cultures, but they can never really get along. There can never be aggregation of taxes and central schemes and so on and so forth. And therefore, over the long run, you will get very, very bad development outcomes in the country and across states, right? And what's very nice about this book is that those are sort of two literatures that, if you have gone through a political science department, especially in the U.S. over the last 10 years, literature on federalism, literature on ethnic politics, this is what you're fed. This is a book that pushes back on a lot of that and sort of explains how you can start with social fractionalization and perhaps get good social development outcomes. A second sort of point that I'd like to make here is that it actually flips what is the standard logic that is used to explain why social fractionalization is bad. So she talked about the social identity perspective. So there are a lot of very interesting psychology experiments that are conducted in this literature. So one of them I remember, and there are a bunch of these, is you randomly assign people red shirts and you randomly assign people blue shirts, and then you went and asked them. It turns out the red people, the red shirt people, started feeling some solidarity and started hating the blue shirt people, and so on and so forth. Like this, there's all sorts of funny things like this happening in psychology, and it's usually used to explain why it's so easy to get people to fight. And this is completely flipping it, which is saying, why is it possible that in a place where things are fractionalized, it might be possible to get people together? Right? So the first set of questions I have here, and I'm going to say my comments are going to be pretty short, I think, so we can give more time to discuss to questions, is about the case selection. So, in some sense, for those of us who study India, if you pick, essentially Ru and Bimaru, right, Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh, and then Tamil Nadu and Kerala on the other side, intuitively there are large differences between these states, and I think, as a previous comment show, we come up with a number of theories that might be differing between these cases. What I wonder is, how the theory graphs. I'm sure it does graft onto, but how it graphs onto variation in other vernacular states. So, if I think about sort of, situating this in a slightly more historical context, we think of Tamil Nadu as being carved out of the Madras president, so Madras presidents, there were a lot of the Tamil Nadu was carved out of a larger unit. But the same can actually be said about Bihar and Orissa, right? They're carved out of the Bengal presidency. So why is it that in one case we sort of observe something that is viewed as coming out of a subnationalist movement and one as not so, right? So in the book, Bihari subnationalism is thought to really start showing up quite recently and not at the time of actual sort of, at the time of its creation. I think, similarly, one of the things I wonder about is, imagine that you had picked, imagine that you had picked some of these other vernacular states, right? So imagine that we didn't pick Tamil Nadu and Kerala. It's two extremely successful states, but West Bengal, which is somewhat mixed in some ways, although not actually on the indicators that you use. That actually West Bengal does quite well, which is funny to see because it doesn't do well on a number of other indicators. Maharashtra, Orissa, Assam, right? Some of them are not viewed as being strongly subnational states in your data, and I was wondering if you'd comment a little bit about how you've constructed the idea of subnationalism and how that's different from the vernacularization of these movements, right? There's clearly a distinction in the data, and I was wondering if you could sort of give some more information as to what that is. And I'm not interested in it from a data perspective as such. What I mean is, substantively, because language is such an important part of the way that the indicators are constructed, substantively, how are you distinguishing between sort of some notion of linguistic nationalism or linguistic regionalism and subnationalism as a concept? So I think there's another set of cases that one can think about where movements may turn violent, where movements are sort of separate movements. I know this is a question you've been asked before, but I'd like some sort of clarity. So imagine that you had taken a case like Kashmir, right? That perhaps the book would look very different, right? And it's in some ways not a fair criticism in that I think you are talking about sort of cases that are not intended to be that don't have this set of historical and regional factors that Kashmir has. But it does beg the question that when and why does a movement become subnational in the way that you mean it, as opposed to, let's say, separatist? One could have taken Khalistan or Gurkhaland, or what can one see about the aims of such a movement early on that would tell you something about what kinds of demands would be made from a subnational perspective? So, the strongest part of this story is to sort of show how subnationalism, as constructed in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, really pushed on demands for health and education as opposed to any other demand, any number of demands that could have been made, roads or something else, right? So you already talked about the distinction between economic development, income, and other social development indicators. A similar question is, why aim for that level of grand coalition at all, right? So the standard sort of political science approach is that you want a minimum winning coalition. You want just enough, and then keep all the benefits for yourself. So why not sort of create a set of economic and health incentives that only benefit 50% of the population, right? I think relatedly, sort of along these lines, I think I'd like to know a little bit about when a subnational movement might fail, or when it might do something that doesn't look like the places that you've talked about. Like, I would want to know something about the language movement in Assam, or I want to know something about how you think about the Shiv Sena. And are they sort of versions of this argument that haven't quite gotten there? In the future, will they? Are there structural factors that mean that the kind of linguistic nationalist movements and subnationalism we associate with these kinds of parties is qualitatively different than what we've seen in the southern states? And then finally, and this is a very political sciencey sort of criticism, aren't there other strategies for unification in divided society, like consociationalism? So consociationalism, by the way, is a theory in which, much maligned theory now, but I felt like I had to bring it up, is a theory that was used to describe what was happening in places like Netherlands and Switzerland, where you had ethnically divided societies, and every ethnic group got a proportional representation for their own ethnic group, and then made everyone love each other, love everyone else, right? This is sort of the...
Or just not hate.
Huh? Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And there's in fact a very famously maligned article about why India is a consociational democracy, which it's not. Okay, so I think what I'd like so those are just sort of some very specific comments and questions I have about how the argument of the book applies to sort of larger questions within India. I also wonder if you could sort of comment on current developments in India. And so I think most of you know that I work on political behavior now. And we were talking about this a bit earlier. We're seeing sort of an interesting time in Indian politics where OBC leaders who have a dedicated OBC base are starting to make sort of subnational development-like claims. So we have Akhilesh, who is, sort of a Yadav leader, comes from sort of a Yadav leader background, but clearly he is intending to move beyond sort of standard Yadav politics. You have Sachin Pilot moving beyond Gujar politics. You have Nitish Kumar moving beyond Kurmi politics, right, and so on and so forth, right? Is this something that, are we seeing essentially a later wave, another manifestation of the argument that you make in this book? And can you comment a little bit on where you see these sorts of leaders moving? Do you see them being successful in the long run? Do you see the development outcomes changing? So I think, just wrapping up, I know I don't want to take away everyone else's time. I just want to sort of say that, this is an incredibly important argument for one special thing that it's bringing into the literature, right? We're not looking at ethnicity or ethnic division as something that's sort of God-given. It is taking the idea that one can construct identity, subnational or otherwise, very seriously, and thinking about why that might be. And the reason why it's very careful work is, I think, as I said, at first blush, you look at states like UP and Rajasthan, you look at states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, based on what we know today, and you say, well, okay, that's obvious, something. But this is an argument that's actually not about, what we see now. The outcomes are what we see now. But it's about a process that sort of leads to these outcomes. And so, I learned a huge amount from this book. And I do think that it will be required reading for those of us who work on India. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Nilanjan. To begin by, sure, it's obvious from the reception the book has received that it's going to be required reading everywhere, and now you're going to have more or less required reading in India. It's and I think it speaks to the accessibility of the book in some sense, and the very nice way in which Prerna, as you saw from her presentation, organizes her thoughts. That the book is something that does provoke a fair deal of reaction and raises a number of questions in your mind, which I think is the hallmark of a really great book. So, it's obvious that it's not only engaging with large questions in political theory, as Nilanjan pointed out, it's also sort of offering very differing explanations to what the Indian story is, as Santosh's remarks made quite clear. So now, to me, to summarize what I understand the process, as Nilanjan said, there's a construction of a subnational identity, and it need not necessarily be subnational. Subnational is just a phrase that can be over any bounded political space, by elites, and typically, as you pointed out, this is in reaction to an established elite. And one of the reasons I felt a little cheated was that process. Perhaps, especially in a book, maybe it'd be useful to spell that out a bit more about the whole process of what is it that starts that reaction story to move forward. And then it sort of travels from the elite it travels from the elite across to others in society, as sort of a popular adoption or diffusion, if you will, in cases like Tamil Nadu, triggered by events like the Hindi agitation, and the attempts to Hindi, and so on and so forth. And again, this process of diffusion is something that would be useful to sort of think about in terms of how this differs across different spaces. And this shared identity, in some sense, then creates what goes back to an old concept in management called solidarity, three types of incentives: material incentives, which we all know about; purposive incentives, if all of us get together to sort of clean up India; and solidarity incentives, which basically in some sense, the best form of stuff where you're doing things because you like doing things together. And so it creates a pretty strong kind of bond in some sense, which leads the state to supply public goods and the people to demand public goods. And not only to demand public goods, I mean, most importantly, for somebody like Yamini, to sort of horizontally monitor the quality of these public goods in some sense. And this obviously then leads to these wonderful outcomes that Prerna finds. And it is that sort of relatively, and I think the light that Prerna shines on solidarity incentives not only leads us to question and realize that there are many types of reasons why people actually act in this world, rather than the standard sort of rational material gain that economists love talking about. So, and I think that's an important part of that story. The point where I then sort of, and there are a number of interesting spaces, I think, where one can take this. One space, since Prerna is now working on India and China, is to think about, and to take on from agrarian systems that Santosh spoke about, is the whole rice theory of how communities which cultivate rice somehow more have high solidarity values or solidary things than communities which could cultivate wheat. All these Rajasthanis and UP walas and so on and so forth. So the
They also eat the wheat.
I don't.
so there is that. It's the nature of how these cultivation practices are across the space. There's actually a whole theory out there that looks between North China and South China sort of drives that particular space. There is also the issue of, and to take on also not just the gradient system, the effect of the mutiny and what it does to political structures across the North and the South. And in a sense, post the mutiny, there's been in some sense a deliberate destruction of established political formations, in UP certainly, and also in Rajasthan to some extent. And does that have any effect on what you are finding today in some sense? And in some sense, I see both this question and the question of the agrarian question that Santosh raised as sort of deeper questions that influence whether or not subnationalism sort of can cohere in some sense. And because it's like that, I'm just curious when you get to your, so let me just spend a couple of minutes on the policy story and then finish, because that's where I get very pessimistic, and I'm so glad that you just have 2 pages on it. One is, over what time period are we talking about these things? I mean, you mentioned Bihar and you in passing, and you talk about other things, but is it really the sense I get from your broader work on Kerala, Tamil Nadu, UP, and Rajasthan, is that this process of subnational solidarity is a process that is decades, if not longer, in its process of formation. And so do we really, if something starts happening now, when would I expect sort of Bihar to sort of benefit? No, I mean, it's an interesting, if you look at Shanxi in China and Shenzhen, you'll find the same kind of things. And the other is, I am actually, and I know that you're pushing back against this bleak political theory about the impossibility of development in fractionalized spaces. But it leaves me, in some sense, your solution leaves me deeply disturbed. Because in some sense, what your solution is, this construction of the subnational identity, is not papering it over as perhaps a light word, is sort of cementing over those differences, right? But it does involve, as you said, the creation or the necessity of the other. And especially given what I see happening in Europe and even in India right now, is it necessary for there to be an other to get good welfare outcomes? Can we think of solidarities over, which is where I think most of the associational structures, etc., have come through, where you don't really need to define an other in such specific terms to be able to, and the only, given all identities now I think are constructed including gender, you're left with basically the human identities as people, as citizens, as equals, whatever that you're going to call it. That would be required if you want to, and do you think there is any space whatsoever? Because if not, then in some sense, in the formation of these solidarity or creation of these solidarity incentives also is the creation of, especially in a place like India, where you'll have multiple sort of subnationals, the creation of possible routes for splintering. And to what extent does that, how do you then, if this is strong, how you then cohere to build up a national and even sort of then an international story, as you're now beginning to find out that particular. So if I take this argument, if I take your argument, if accepted, where would I land up in is the question. So that's I mean on the numbers front there are I don't think this is we can talk about that at some other time. So what would you like to do? Would you like to take these three on and then sort of take
Could
on a
I
bit
very
more?
briefly?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I really want to make sure that we leave enough time for discussion. So I'll be very, very quick. And thank you all, Partho, Nilanjan, and especially Santosh for these amazing set of comments. And, you know, in a sense, I can't think of a kind of better way to be grilled and pushed and asked to extend. And especially because you write a book, but you don't stop thinking either about the book or about, you know, new ways that the book falls short or can do more. And so this is actually a very, very helpful set of comments. And I know that they come from a close reading of the book, for which I'm especially grateful at this kind of very festive moment in Delhi when everyone has 10 other things to do. So thank you for taking the time to actually read it. So in terms of, you know, I want to kind of group a few of Santosh's points and Partho's, as he himself suggested, together, just in terms of, you know, flagging. So this is at a very basis, and Nilanjan brought this out in his comments, a deeply constructivist argument. It's also an argument for the role of ideas. And I think when you're talking about ideas as they move, both in terms of psychological processes in your head, which is the experiments that we were talking about, but also through these ideas of, you know, what is my obligation, what is my commitment, there is a way in which they can sometimes be both difficult to put forward, but also relatively easy to put down. And I'll talk about it because, in a sense, structure is solid. It's easy to see. There's a large tradition of people who have seen it. And I want to begin by saying that I'm not at all suggesting that subnationalism is the only factor at play. And there is a way in which, and perhaps this is where American academia pushes us a little bit, is that there's a way in which when you're putting forward an argument, there is a sense in which, you know, it's the defining new and only argument, and I'm by no means suggesting that. So it's not at all the case that I don't think that these structural factors are important. However, I would like to say that I think much more has been made of them than perhaps is warranted. And the reason why I say it is because, and this is why I mean that it's at the heart of it a deeply constructivist argument, is because I don't think that they stand without subnationalism. And let me just say it very quickly. So in terms of the factors that Santosh mentioned, demography, in particular the caste composition, social movements, political parties, the nature of the agrarian system, and I think Partho's very thought-provoking point about the influence of the mutiny, which I must confess I have not thought systematically about, but is so provocative, as you often say, that I can't help probably but think about it for a while. So yours might be a kind of slower answer. Santosh's are points that I have thought quite clearly about, because these are immediately, in a way, the factors that you encounter when you take on a topic such as this. So I guess my point is that the caste composition of a state is relatively slow to change. Demography, by definition, is slow to change. And yet, you see differences in identification with very similar structural demographics. So if it was the case that caste demographics was in a way determinative, the question that it then brings out is, why do you see subnationalism emerge at some points in time with the same caste composition and not at other places? And to me, the interesting thing is, you know, Santosh mentioned the state of Tamil Nadu, and it's quite interesting because of the fact that I think Tamil Nadu is a very interesting case in which it moves from a caste-based movement to a subnational movement. So I guess I'll make 2 points. One is, I don't think that, and this leaches into the second point about social movements, it's not that I don't think social movements are important, but in a sense, Santosh asked the question that I think in a way brings out the importance of subnationalism. So Santosh said, you know, why is it that you see cross-caste solidarity in a place like Kerala and a place like Tamil Nadu, but you don't see it in a place like UP? And what I understood his answer to be was that in a way Kanchiram and Mayawati are not strong enough. They're not powerful enough, either intellectuals or political mobilizers, to put forward the kind of identity that someone like Sri Narayan Guru in Kerala or Periyar in Tamil Nadu is. And I guess my point is, the interesting thing is not so much that, but I would say that the reason why you manage to see cross-caste solidarity, and again, I think the importance of history is really important here. Because if you go back to the late 19th century, Vivekanand, who's visiting different parts of India and kind of writing these missives from different states, goes to Kerala and says, finally, I encounter the lunatic asylum of caste. And he documents the fact that in Kerala you see not just untouchability but unseeability. So pollution is communicated not merely through touch but through sight. He describes the fact that Nadar women are not allowed to cover their breasts, and that that even Nayar women expose their breasts to every passing Nambudri as a sign of respect. Right? So this is the late 19th century, and this is the state of Kerala. So if you had to kind of make an argument for the fact that there's something about either the composition or something about, in a sense, not just the demographics, but the division, the bite of caste. Caste bites hard in Kerala in the 19th century. And yet you see that these different social movements of caste come together in a very powerful way just 20 or 30 years later. How does that happen?
Social movements.
But if it was just social movements, because you see those social, but you yourself, who is such an astute observer of UP, have seen those social movements in UP. And yet, as you yourself says, Mayawati remains, a Chamar leader. She can barely be, but the Bahujan Samaj has aspirations of the Bahujan, right? And of Samaj. And in a sense, her saying that, Brahmins are our allies is in a way kind of her saying, look, this is not just a Dalit party anymore. Right? So that's the point, is that yes, you can have demographics, yes, you can have social movements, but in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, it's not just social movements, it's the fact that these social movements have a particular content. So Periyar remains a non-Brahmin leader. Annadurai becomes a Tamil subnationalist. And in many ways, Jayalalitha, in a very poignant interview, had once said, how do you think that I as a Brahmin rule and command this non-Brahmin party? And because she said, you fundamentally mistake the fact that we are not non-Brahmin, we are Tamil. And so her point is, the Adi Dravida and the Brahmin and the OBC are all part of the same community. So you can have, so the point that I want to make, the analytical point, is that you can have social movements and not have social welfare. UP in the 1990s, because I do think that Kanshiram is a very serious ideologue, and I would not dismiss him by saying, look, he's merely a populist, because that same, if you look at the way that Periyar is received, he has a very critical reception in Tamil Nadu in what was then Madras presidency. And so my point is, you can have social movements without the kind of, consequences that one would expect. It's not sufficient. It's not even necessary in a certain way. Because Rajasthan sees those gains in the 1990s without the social movements in a way. It sees it through very important civil society and government collaborations. But not just that, it's also the fact that you can only see these kind of alliances emerge against, even in a highly divided caste society like Kerala, because of the fact that you begin to see a sense of being Malayali. So in the book I talk a lot about, where does the word Malayali come from? Until the late 1900s, the word Malayali was exclusively used to refer to Nayars. And yet within a matter of 10 years, and this gets to the point about temporality, it's now a word that's used to refer to all people who speak Malayalam. So suddenly you can be Malayali just by virtue of speaking Malayalam, while previously you had to be a Nayar. And this is an active construction. There's nothing about the demographics that would determine this. And so I would say that, and I try to show, you can see this in the difference in timing between Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Malayali subnationalism emerges about 25 years before it emerges in Tamil Nadu, even though the caste composition of the two states is remarkably similar. And so, I think the short answer would be you kind of need to take a step back historically, but also the fact that, you yourself in a way said it, it's not the ding-dong between political parties, coming to point number 3, that determines social welfare. We've seen a lot of ding-dongs in Indian states. Some people think it's the answer, some people think it's the problem. It's the problem that what is it that ding-dong, what are the ding-dongs fighting about? Are they fighting about patronage distribution? How many saris, how many laddus? How much alcohol are you distributing around election time, surreptitiously? Or are you kind of fighting, as in the case of Tamil Nadu, about how many cataract correction surgery clinics you're opening, you are giving the mixers and the grinders, but you're also giving, a lot of other things. And so there's a lot of people would argue that in a way, calling Tamil politics populist kind of disguises the fact that there is a really strong ideological progressive content to it. But I'm happy to talk about this further detail, but just the point about the nature of the agrarian system. So, and perhaps I didn't bring this out as clearly in the book as I should have, and this also gets to Nilanjan's point, which I'll get to about case selection. One of the beauties of comparing some place like Kerala and Tamil Nadu and also a state like UP is that you have Ryotwari and Zamindari in very close proximity. Right, so Abhijit Banerjee and Rohini Somanathan, as well as people who have disagreed with them, have made a lot about. So there's a very famous article by Iyer and Somanathan that basically says that the differences in social welfare, welfare as well as a number of other indicators, and they don't quite conceptualize it exactly as I do, are basically determined by Ryotwari or Zamindari. But what they point out is that there is so much Ryotwari and Zamindari within a certain state. So I don't think there's any simple way in which you can say, look, UP is Zamindari, and Madras presidency is by no way uniformly Ryotwari. On the other hand, if you look at a state like Kerala, Malabar is Ryotwari, but Travancore and Cochin are princely feudal states that in many ways are analogous to Bikaner, Jodhpur. We don't use the word feudal to describe Kerala, but these are princely states. And so I would say that the agrarian system is actually a really important underlying argument that I deliberately try to control for by choosing states that have both direct and indirect rule. So Kerala, as well as Rajasthan, are indirectly ruled princely states, and Madras presidency and the United Provinces are both directly ruled states. But in all these states, you have Zamindari and Ryotwari kind of coexisting, and they don't, according to Iyer and Somanathan, they would map onto district level differences. But Kunal Sen at University of Manchester, a number of others have said, look, even this whole blanket Ryotwari Zamindari is really a massacre of the kind of nuance in the type of very, very different agrarian settlements that existed. So they talk about Mansabdari and about 22 other kinds of settlements. And so they say, Zamindari, Ryotwari were colonial words that we use. If you really look at what was happening, how tax was collected, how things were distributed, there are about 101 different types of agrarian settlements within India. But the basic point is that I'm not at all saying that these are unimportant. But in a sense, I don't think for sure you can understand the importance of demographic, social movements, or political parties without looking at the content that they're imbued with. So two-party competition to me means nothing until you look at what those two parties are fighting about. And that will be critically different in a state that is subnationalist and a state that's not. And I also, of course, control for all of these in the statistical regressions. And what's important is that these all turn out to be significant in the way that you would predict. But subnationalism still matters. And so statistically, my point would be what I began with, which is it's a value-added controlling or taking into account all these other important factors. Very quick, I want to leave enough time, but thank you, Nilanjan, for a really important set of comments. I laugh because I always wait for the one Bengali who won't mention Bengal.
No, it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, it hasn't happened yet.
I went before Partho though. That's why.
That is true. I was going to take bets. Is it going to be Partho or Nilanjan? So it's a. But I think your point about not at all to reduce your point. Bengal is a really interesting case that because of the predominance of Bengalis in academia, I get asked a lot about. But also, does it sound like I have? But so I think Bengal is quite interesting because it also points to what you mentioned, which is this point about when does the movement become secessionist, and so the short answer is that I think you make an important point about differences in vernacularization and differences in subnationalism. Bengal is a very curious case in which on many instances at face value it has a high degree of Bengali nationalism, distinctiveness, and yet in a way, except for education and health in which it still looks not so bad, on other indicators it looks awful. I mean, there's a whole movement to kind of include West Bengal in the Bimaru category by some people, right? And so why does this happen? Also really interesting because it shows you the limits of an argument that would say that it's the Communist Party that is responsible for gains in social welfare. But I think what it gets to is this point about the construction of subnationalism, but also the boundaries of it. So I would argue that Bengali nationalism is a very Bhadralok nationalism. And if you look, for instance, at Bengal, it's interesting that it has two state languages, which is a nod to the very active and secessionist Gorkha land movement. And so always from the very beginning, Bengali and Nepali have had equal status in Bengal. And so there's a way, I think, in which Bengali subnationalism has kind of proclaimed itself, partly because of its Bhadralok content, to be far more powerful than it really has. And this gets to the point about diffusion, which I think is an important point. So I would argue that there's elite Bengali subnationalism, but that it hasn't really vernacularized itself in that sense of having a kind of popular base. But, you know, again, happy to kind of talk about this. The point about Kashmir and secession is a really important one. I get around it by saying, look, the scope conditions of the argument are, as soon as this becomes coercive on the part of the national government, it becomes a fundamentally different ball game, partly because you're also affecting how schools run and hospitals function when you're really an occupied territory in many ways. And you know, I won't answer your point about when does subnationalism fail, but by saying that there are two ways to understand that question, both in the context of the Shiv Sena and Assam. One is, does subnationalism fail in that it just doesn't become strong? Or does it fail in the way that the argument fails, which is that it fails to lead to social welfare? And I think that that's a kind of important distinction. And, you know, I'll leave it at that. I won't answer it, but I think, you know, the answer depends on how you think of it. So Partho, again, thank you. And all I'll say is that, you know, I'll just say that, you know, the rice theory is important because what it gets at is that there is no one route to solidarity. And I don't again want to suggest that mine is the only one. I point to an ideational route, and you point in a way to a kind of more structural, material route. So solidarity can come because it emerges as this idea that has a long gestation period, and the question of how long is an important one. But it can also develop because, you know, you just cultivate a particular crop that requires you to come together, right? But my point is, there's rice cultivation and then there's successful rice cultivation, right? And so I would say that, you know, even for that kind of collective occupational labor endeavor to be successful, and in the conclusion of the book, I talk about the fact that I used to initially describe the book as in conflict with class-based arguments, and I've modified that, partly because of something like the rice theory, which is that actually it's just a corrective to class-based arguments, is that even if you read people like E.P. Thompson, they argue even when class works at its best is when it has a sense of community. So the rice cultivation will work best if they're also a kind of solidaristic bunch of rice farmers. And that doesn't simply happen because they cultivate rice. That happens because they think of themselves subjectively constructed as a certain sense of a we and an us.